So I'll admit that there's often a big disconnect between what gets taught on YouTube DIY channels and what's actually getting practiced out in the construction field. Professional carpenters take way more risks while they're working, and their techniques often directly violate safety guidelines that get discussed on channels like mine. Obviously, carpenters do these things because it speeds up their work or just makes it easier. But many of these violations are clearly just a bad idea. Like pinning up your circular saw blade guard. You should never do that. And yet other techniques are a bit harder to condemn because they contain at least a kernel of logic or wisdom. Today I'm discussing 7 of these controversial cutting techniques. These are the things that make DIYers ask, why can they do that but I can't? And how dangerous is it really? Just keep in mind that by showing these techniques, I'm not encouraging anybody to use them. I'm not suggesting that they're better. I simply put them here to explain why carpenters use them, and so that you can see what makes them dangerous, and thereby be better informed. Also, it's been my experience that by refusing to discuss these things, we can actually create a riskier environment. People will often still go out and try them anyways, but they'll just be completely unprepared for what could go wrong. So I think it's better to get it all out in the open and let knowledge be the guide. But I'll say right now, for the record, you should continue to follow all normal safety guidelines while using power tools. Any work you carry out is at your own risk, and we do not take any responsibility for keeping anybody safe. Only you can do that. Also, I did recently post a free guide on my website to the 10 worst power tool mistakes, and that video contains some very detailed breakdowns on power tool safety. So I highly suggest you go sign up for the guide, because in many ways it's kind of a precursor to this video. I'll even mention some of those topics here as we go along. Alright, that's my big scary warning. With all that said, let's get straight into the 7 most controversial cutting techniques in carpentry. That's coming up next on the Honest Carpenter Show. We'll start with the elephant in the room, the topic I get asked about every week, blade guard removal. I know I just said that anybody who pins their circular saw guard is a fool because outrageously dangerous things can happen when the saw gets loose. Just see the free guide on my website to confirm that. And the miter saw guard is also absolutely essential because without it, we would be exposed to just way too much spinning blade. But as many people point out, I do have the blade guard removed on my table saw pretty much every time I use it, as do most professional carpenters. So, what gives? Why are blade guards so essential on some power saws, but people are allowed to dispense of them on the table saw? I'll start by saying that really, you shouldn't dispense of the table saw blade guard. The guard is by far the best way to prevent yourself from coming into contact with the spinning blade. So, you should keep it on whenever you're cutting. But at the same time, I'll admit that the table saw blade guard in particular does have some drawbacks. For instance, it prevents a lot of visibility by making it harder to see your cut line. And it can become a detriment on tighter rips because you may have a hard time getting a push stick to go by it. On top of that, some cuts, like grooves and dados, will actually require you to remove the guard to complete your pass. So carpenters will often just keep their blade guards off for convenience and efficiency. And I remove mine so you can actually see what I'm doing when I'm using the table saw here on the channel. But notice that I don't remove the whole thing. I always leave the riving knife on during normal usage. These splitter fins keep stock from binding on the blade, thereby stabilizing your cut. They're so effective and unobtrusive that it would be foolish to take it off. So I always have at least that part of the guard on, and pretty much all other carpenters keep their riving knives on too. So when it comes down to it, you should use your blade guard, especially if you're new to saw usage. It's just the safest method. But quick removal is an option that's designed into the tool, and that's why there's onboard storage for the guard. You just have to exercise lots of caution when it's not installed. Switching over to miter saws, we come to controversial cutting technique number 2, tilting up the board. Every miter saw has a certain cut capacity. The blade can only reach so far across a board before it hits its limit, and it can't really cut anything wider than that on one pass. So you're forced to rotate the board to finish the cut from the other side, which is fairly safe so long as your cutoff piece is stabilized, and somewhat accurate as long as your blade alignment is good. But it is tedious. To get around this, some carpenters pull off a slightly risky operation. They tilt the board up while they're cutting. Because the blade is curved, the lowest part of it is actually the shortest point of reach, but the higher part of the curve reaches a couple inches farther. So carpenters will pin the board to the fence, bring the spinning blade all the way down into the board, Then, lift the front edge of the board upwards so it rides up through the farthest point of the blade, thereby allowing them to finish the cut. I've got to say, as clever as this seems, you really probably shouldn't do it, because it's dangerous for a few reasons. The first is that the offcut piece will just come plonking down once it's loose, and it can cause havoc if it falls off the table. You can't clamp that side down if you're tilting the board up. Second, it's removing your most stable point of contact, the saw bed. Now you're relying on the inside corner of the two faces for support alone, which is less stable. And furthermore, you'll push the blade guard way up past its coverage point, exposing more spinning blade with every inch. It's just too much to focus on at once. If you need to cut something that won't fit in your miter saw's cut range, just use a circular saw instead. Set up on a table or even the floor to make the cut. It may be slower, but it's much more stable. Controversial technique number 3 is similar, but on a different tool. Flip ripping on the table saw. Everybody knows that long rips on the table saw can be a major headache. You either have to have someone catching your outfeed piece, or you have to have some sort of outfeed table, possibly a portable stand. Otherwise, pieces leveraging off the bat can lift your cut off the blade and fall down, which is very dangerous because they can pull you onto the blade. You won't always have someone there on the outfeed to catch pieces though, and setting up or creating supports can be tedious. So a method you see people using on the job site a lot is flip ripping. This is when you take a longer piece, begin ripping it, then when you get to the halfway point, or just past, you simply lift your end off the saw bed. You can then swivel it away carefully, flip it end for end, being sure to keep the same original edge towards the fence, and start ripping from what was a moment ago, the far end. Now the two cuts meet in the middle, and you once again carefully lift them away. The reason this is a no-no is because it does involve some wrangling of the board around the spinning blade. You might twist it or drop the board while you're lifting, which can create a bad situation. Otherwise, of all these methods, I've always kind of seen flip ripping as a fairly stable one. The curvature of the table saw blade is such that the moment you raise your end, you lose most immediate contact with the blade. Then, both pieces are really well supported in the center when the two cuts meet, and you don't risk that crazy back leverage situation on a full-length rip. So, while you probably shouldn't do it, this method does solve some problems and keeps things relatively safe. But one of the only other issues with it is that you may not have had perfect alignment on one of the passes, and the two cuts might wind up not meeting perfectly in the center. You'll get this radial ridge where the saw blade was slightly off track. It's usually not much, and this notch can be sanded or planed out, but this is prone to happening with flip ripping. And this brings us to another method that is highly controversial, but complicated. Number 4, back pulling on the table saw. Back pulling is when you push a longer piece through the blade, but instead of using an outfeed support or flip ripping, you simply go around to the other side and draw the board the rest of the way through by hand. Now, off the bat, I'll say that this is controversial because everybody knows that you aren't supposed to pull pieces from the back of the table saw, nor should you reach over the table saw to clear them away. I talk about this extensively in my guide to power tool mistakes, and it's a bedrock rule that I think you should never ever violate, especially when you're cutting shorter pieces. There's just too much risk of your hand getting sucked back into the blade. But this situation does change a little when you're cutting longer pieces, say anything over 5 feet. Why is that? Really, for a couple reasons. One, longer pieces are just less likely to kick or get thrown very hard. They're just bigger and heavier, and the saw, even with 15 amps, will struggle to get that much mass moving backwards at a high speed, unless it's a very skinny piece, in which case it's still possible. But 2, you can also keep your hands much farther away from the blade. When someone is back pulling a longer piece, they'll typically grab near the far end, then draw carefully, being sure to keep the inner edge touching the rip fence. That's where the focus of the eye is in this method, on the fence, not really on the blade. If a bind-up happens here, it's more likely to yank the piece from their hands, but not necessarily with enough force to draw them in. A bind-up very close to the blade possibly means bye-bye fingers, unless the riving knife saves you. But back pulling from a few feet away doesn't pose quite as many risks. But just remember that this method does require letting go of the board and moving around the table while the saw is running, both of which are big no-nos. And long pieces can also flex as you draw them through, which means you may have to arc your end of the board up higher as you get farther back, which is awkward, and you may get bad drop-off from the table if you're not careful, which is dangerous. So for those reasons, it's generally not an approved ripping method. But it is done on job sites a lot because it's quick, and people feel that they can negotiate the risks. Mistake number 5 is a very common source of curiosity: cutting on the foot. Everybody sees video of carpenters setting a board on their foot just to lop a piece off the end. They do this for speed and convenience, and also to prevent the blade from cutting into their floor surface, which is a common concern while cutting. But let me be the first to tell you, there's no need to cut on your foot. Yes, it may be faster, but it brings the saw way too close to your foot, especially your shoelaces, which might get sucked into the blade arbor. And it just puts you in this awkward, unbalanced position. It's harder to get your line up here, and it has always seemed precarious to me. Instead, just find the tiniest little scrap of wood and prop your board on that. I used to keep one laying around just for this purpose. That gives you all the clearance you need. But cutting on the foot, just don't do it. There's no need for it. That brings us to a similar issue with the circular saw. Number 6, roll cutting posts. Cutting 4x4s can often be a pain, especially with the circular saw, because the 2.5-inch blade depth limit means you can only cut just over halfway through in one pass. So you have to scribe your line on all sides with the square and cut 3 different sides one at a time before you finally cut all the way through. Many carpenters forego this by rolling the post as they cut it, which can be a pretty tricky technique. To do this, they'll often have a longish support lying down with the 4x4 propped on it. They'll start the top cut pass, then, as they're just pushing through the far edge, they'll actually roll the post towards themselves. The saw plate will fall onto the next ledge, the blade will sink in, and they'll continue tracking their line. On the third edge, the piece will fall free. Pros will insist that it gives you a cleaner cut line because the blade stays in the material the whole time, kind of guaranteeing alignment. But take it from me, it's not easy. In rolling the post, it's also possible that you twist it or turn it, especially if your piece is up high on a table. Plus, your blade is at full depth, which means that you can bind up more easily. And it can just be a lot to keep track of, including with what's happening to your prop piece. Whatever advantages it has are just outweighed by these issues. So, do yourself a favor, avoid roll cutting posts. Just do it the old-fashioned way, turning the post over one face at a time, focusing on getting good blade alignment in the kerf, possibly even using a speed square as a guide. And remember that no matter what method you use, you have to ensure that your plate is actually square to your blade. Otherwise, your ends will come out looking jagged and multi-planar every time. And controversial cutting technique number 7 is one that's rarely discussed, but it's very interesting. Gravity ripping on the table saw. One of the issues with using a table saw outside is that your ground will rarely be flat. Your saw's top may be a few degrees off level, and this can affect your cutting because the board may want to wander away from the fence, creating a skewed cut. But gravity ripping is where you intentionally use an uneven surface to actually assist with the cutting. In other words, you aim the saw so that the fence and the outfeed are on the downhill side, but at a slight diagonal. So as you rip, the weight of the board will both secure it to the fence and pull it through the blade, thereby easing the operator's burden. This method is often paired with back pulling because gravity just sort of makes the two work together well, keeping things secure and aligned. It's actually a pretty brilliant strategy, just using physics to your advantage. Except that you're really not supposed to use your table saw on an uneven surface. It can put excessive stress on the legs if your saw is on a stand, and this can easily lead to tipping. Or you can put your saw directly on the ground, which is more stable, but that can create balance issues for the user. For these reasons, gravity ripping can't exactly be called safe, and certainly not on any ground that is like steeply angled. If that's the case, you just need to find a better place to cut. But if you have no choice and your surface is only slightly angled, putting your fence and outfeed on the downhill side of things at a diagonal can make things easier on you. But that's my explanation of the 7 most controversial cutting techniques. Again, remember that I go into a lot more depth on power tool safety in my free guide, The 10 Worst Power Tool Mistakes, so be sure to check that out today at thehonestcarpenter.com. Also, I'll link some good power tools below in case you're just now starting your collection, so feel free to browse those links if you need anything. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm Ethan James with thehonestcarpenter.com. I'll see you next time.